After so many years alone in the jungle, what kept you going?
I wasn't hiding, and I was following my duty. I truly believe the order still stood.
The horizon wasn't just dark, it was alive with the mechanical groans of an approaching apocalypse. The ground beneath Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda's boots didn't just tremble, it convulsed, threatening to throw him to his knees as the shockwaves of coastal impacts rolled through the volcanic soil of Lubang. The air tasted of sulfur, cordite, and pulverized concrete, a gritty paste that coated the back of his throat and made every breath a labor of will. This was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard waiting to be filled, and the American armada crowding the water was the shovel. Major Taniguchi stood amidst the ruins of the airstrip, his uniform stained with the grime of a failing campaign, yet his posture remained rigid, defying the chaos erupting around them. He didn't flinch as a plume of black smoke spiraled up from the jungle edge, marking another strike. He looked straight through Onoda, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity that eclipsed the flashing artillery on the coastline. This was the moment the world split in two. The structured life Onoda knew, and the ghost he was about to become. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand," Taniguchi said, his voice cutting through the roar of the incoming fleet like a blade. "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we will come back for you." The words settled into Onana's marrow, heavier than the pack on his back, colder than the steel of his Arisaka rifle. It was a command that defied the very nature of imperial warfare. To fight was to die, but to survive indefinitely, to become a phantom in the undergrowth, was a torture beyond comprehension. His mind raced, calculating the logistics of the impossible: food sources, water filtration, ammunition conservation. The fear was there, primal and screaming, but his training clamped down on it with iron logic. He was no longer a man. He was a dormant weapon. Out on the water, the American flotilla darkened the sea, a wall of iron closing the noose. Onoda turned his back on the burning horizon. With 3 others trailing in his wake, he stepped off the beaten path and into the dense, suffocating embrace of the tree line. The vegetation was thick, wet, and hostile, tearing at their uniforms as if trying to digest them immediately. As they pushed deeper, the canopy knit together overhead, blotting out the sky and the war, sealing them inside a green tomb where time would soon cease to matter. The long wait had begun. The jungle did not fight with fire or shrapnel. It fought with a suffocating, relentless moisture that sought to dissolve a man while he still breathed. The air inside the canopy was not oxygen, but a heavy, suspended fluid that clung to the skin like a wet wool blanket, trapping body heat until the blood felt as though it were simmering in the veins. Sweat ceased to be a cooling mechanism and became a permanent layer of grime, a slick varnish that mixed with the red clay and decaying leaf litter to turn the soldiers into mud-caked specters. There was no drying out, only varying degrees of dampness that softened the calluses on their feet and invited the rot to set in between their toes. At night, the enemy was microscopic and voracious. Onoda would wake from a shallow, jagged sleep to feel the cold, slimy weight of gorged leeches hanging from his eyelids or the soft flesh behind his knees. They were swollen tight with stolen blood, black grapes of parasites that had to be burned off with a match or sliced away with a knife, leaving weeping sores that refused to scab in the humidity. The insects were a constant, droning vibration in the skull, a biological static that threatened to drown out the necessary signals of danger. To survive, they retreated upward, clawing their way into the jagged spine of the mountains where the air was thinner but the terrain was unforgiving. They constructed a bivouac from woven palm fronds and scavenged wood, a fragile scar on the landscape that offered minimal protection from the torrential rains. Here, the psychology of the soldier began to fracture and reform into something sharper, something feral. Every snap of a dried twig in the distance was not a wild boar or a falling branch. In their minds, it was the click of an American safety catch, the shifting of a heavy boot, the prelude to an ambush that never came. They stripped away the veneer of civilization layer by layer. Their uniforms, once pressed symbols of imperial authority, became tattered second skins, stained with the green blood of the forest and the red rust of the earth. Onoda watched his men transform. Their eyes sank deeper into their skulls, rimmed with the dark bruising of exhaustion, darting with the hypervigilance of prey animals. They stopped speaking in sentences and began communicating in gestures and sharp hisses, their humanity receding to make room for the instincts required to exist in a green hell. From the ridges, they observed the coast through salt-stained binoculars. Down below, American convoys moved like sluggish beetles along the dirt roads, their headlights cutting through the twilight. To Onoda, this was not the traffic of a victorious occupying force settling into peace. It was the logistical movement of an enemy preparing for a counterattack. He interpreted every supply truck as a troop transport, every construction project as a fortification. The war was raging just beyond the tree line, a silent, invisible conflict that only he was disciplined enough to see. The moon rose over Lubang, casting a pale, sickly light through the breaks in the canopy. Onoda sat motionless on a moss-covered rock, his rifle across his knees, staring up at the celestial body with the cold calculation of a machine. He mentally inventoried their ammunition reserves against the number of days in a year, projecting the attrition rate over a decade. He was solving an equation for a variable that no longer existed, plotting tactics for a battlefield that had already been paved over, determined to win a war that the rest of the world had already forgotten. The moon rose over Lubang, casting a pale, sickly light through the breaks in the canopy. Onoda sat motionless on a moss-covered rock, his rifle across his knees, staring up at the celestial body with the cold calculation of a machine. He mentally inventoried their ammunition reserves against the number of days in a year, projecting the attrition rate over a decade. He was solving an equation for a variable that no longer existed, plotting tactics for a battlefield that had already been paved over, determined to win a war that the rest of the world had already forgotten. The moon rose over Lubang, casting a pale, sickly light through the breaks in the canopy. Onoda sat motionless on a moss-covered rock, his rifle across his knees, staring up at the celestial body with the cold calculation of a machine. He mentally inventoried their ammunition reserves against the number of days in a year, projecting the attrition rate over a decade. He was solving an equation for a variable that no longer existed, plotting tactics for a battlefield that had already been paved over, determined to win a war that the rest of the world had already forgotten. The hum of the engine was distinct, a heavy, throbbing bass note that vibrated in the sternum rather than the ears. It was a slow-moving transport plane, flying dangerously low over the jagged spine of Lubang, its shadow rippling across the canopy like a dark shark in a green ocean. Onoda signaled for a halt, his hand cutting through the humid air like a blade. The men froze, their bodies instantly blending into the root systems and fern fronds, becoming indistinguishable from the undergrowth. They waited for the whistle of ordnance, the shrieking descent of a bomb that would turn the hillside into a crater. But the explosion never arrived. Instead, the sky began to shed its skin. Thousands of white rectangles fluttered down through the gaps in the trees, catching the shafts of sunlight like motes of dust in a cathedral. They drifted with a chaotic, hypnotic grace, snagging on thorns and spiraling down to the mud-slicked floor. It was a blizzard in the tropics, a surreal violation of the jungle's oppressive green palette that made the eyes ache with its brightness. For a moment, the sheer absurdity of the sight suspended their fear, replaced by a bewildered curiosity that drew them out from their cover to snatch the falling debris. Kazuka plucked a sheet from a fern leaf. He stared at the bold kanji characters, his lips moving silently as he parsed the message, his brow furrowing in confusion. He handed the paper to Onoda, his hands trembling, not from the residual tremors of malaria, but from the impossible weight of the words printed there. "The war is over. Come down." Onoda did not read the message. He dissected it. He rubbed the paper between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the texture with the sensitivity of a safecracker. It was high-grade bond, smooth and bleached to a blinding white, possessing a tensile strength that wartime Japan could simply not afford. The empire was rationing rice and melting down temple bells for scrap metal. They would not be dropping premium stationery into a Philippine jungle. He brought the paper to his nose. It smelled of industrial chemicals and clean, sharp ink, the scent of American factories, not the desperate, smoky output of Tokyo. Then he analyzed the syntax. The Japanese was technically correct, but it was sterile. It possessed the formal, rigid structure of a textbook translation, lacking the emotive, spiritual resonance of an imperial rescript. It was too polite. It was a linguistic simulacrum created by intelligence officers who understood the grammar of the language, but not the soul of the soldier. "It is a trick," Onoda said, his voice flat and absolute. He crumpled the message in his fist. The enemy was clever, he realized. They were not just attacking the body with bullets. They were attacking the spirit with hope. They sought to weaponize his own desire for home against him, to lure him into the open like a starving dog with a piece of poisoned meat. To accept this paper was to accept defeat, and worse, to walk voluntarily into an ambush constructed of lies. He ordered the men to gather the papers. They did not keep them as souvenirs of peace. They piled the white lies into a small pyramid in a hollow beneath a banyan root and struck a match. The flame caught quickly on the dry, high-quality pulp, curling the edges and turning the white promises into black ash. They warmed their hands over the fire. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, swelling with a barometric pressure that made the inner ear pop and ache. The humidity, previously a suffocating blanket, vanished in an instant, replaced by a sharp, metallic drop in temperature that pricked the skin like needles. There was no gradual buildup, no warning drizzle to herald the coming violence. The typhoon slammed into the ridge with the kinetic force of a locomotive, transforming the atmosphere from air into a churning slurry of water and debris. Their makeshift shelter, a carefully woven lattice of palm fronds and bamboo, disintegrated in seconds. It didn't fall down, it was simply erased. The wind tore the thatched roof from its lashings and sent it spinning into the black void, leaving the men exposed to a deluge that felt less like weather and more like a physical assault. The rain fell horizontally, driven by gale-force gusts that stripped leaves from trees and scoured the topsoil down to the bedrock. It was a vertical ocean, drowning the world in a roar so absolute that Onoda could not hear his own scream of command. He grabbed Kazuka by the shoulder, his grip slipping on the slick, oil-like coating of mud that now covered every inch of their bodies. They could not stay on the flat ground. The water was already ankle-deep and rising, a brown torrent seeking to wash them down into the valley floor. Down there lay the villages, the lights, and the inevitable patrols that would be waiting out the storm in dry barracks. To descend was to die. They had to climb. They scrambled up the spine of the ridge, digging their fingers into the dissolving earth. The mud was treacherous, a living thing that sucked at their boots and tried to pull them off the mountain. It was a chaotic slurry of clay and gravel, sliding beneath them in nauseating shifts. Onoda felt a sudden lightness at his hip, a sickening lack of weight where a canvas satchel had been seconds before. 7mm ammunition, months of precious defense, slide silently over the precipice and vanish into the churning dark below. He did not reach for it. Survival logic overrode the instinct to hoard. Endurance. They wedged themselves into the gnarled architecture of a banyan root system, wrapping their arms around the wood like lovers clinging to a sinking ship. The cold began to set in, a cruel irony in the heart of the tropics. It was a wet, penetrating chill that bypassed the skin and settled directly into the marrow. Onoda's body began to convulse, violent tremors that he could not control. His jaw clamping shut so hard he feared his molars would shatter under the strain. He looked at his hands, illuminated by a flash of lightning that turned the jungle into a strobe-lit nightmare. The skin was no longer brown or tan. It was a corpse-like gray, wrinkled and waterlogged. The blood shunted deep into the core to preserve vital organs. Nature was trying to drown the soldier, but the soldier refused to die. He pressed his face against the wet bark, inhaling the scent of ozone and rot, and waited for the world to stop screaming. The raid. Hunger. Hunger was no longer a sensation. It was a parasite that had hollowed out their rib cages and replaced their organs with a dull, throbbing ache. It distorted their vision, turning the lush greenery of the tree line into a mocking gray blur, and it rewired their neural pathways until risk assessment became impossible. Logic dictated that approaching the settlement was suicide, but the starvation reflex overrode the tactical mind. They moved through the tall elephant grass not as men, but as predatory shadows, the scent of wood smoke and livestock manure pulling them toward the village perimeter like a physical tether. Onoda watched the farmhouse from the edge of the clearing, his eyes stinging with the salt of dried sweat. To anyone else, the figures moving near the lamplight were farmers ending their day. To Onoda, conditioned by years of absolute doctrine, they were enemy combatants disguised in civilian rags, collaborators who had turned the island into a prison. There was no moral hesitation when they selected the target. The kill. The cow was tethered near a rough-hewn fence, its flank heaving rhythmically in the humid night air. Shimada moved first, his knife glinting briefly under the starlight before burying itself in the animal's neck. There was a wet, heavy gurgle, a sound of rushing fluid that seemed deafening in the silence, followed by the heavy thud of collapsing weight. The smell hit them instantly, the hot, metallic copper tang of fresh blood mixing with the earthy stench of the disturbed soil. It was the scent of survival. Then a shutter banged open. A beam of artificial light sliced through the darkness, blinding them. A shout erupted from the porch, raw and panicked, shattering the stealth they had relied on. Onoda didn't think. He reacted. He raised his rifle, but the darkness erupted before he could squeeze the trigger. The air snapped with the violent report of hunting rifles. It wasn't the organized, rhythmic fire of a military squad. It was a chaotic, terrifying barrage. Bullets tore through the foliage around them, shredding leaves and thumping dully into the trunks of the coconut trees. Dirt kicked up into Onoda's face, gritty and blinding. This was not a battle. It was a botched robbery turned into a scramble for life. They grabbed the severed quarters of the animal, the meat slick and impossible to hold, and turned back toward the black mouth of the jungle. The rout. Panic turned the retreat into a rout. Akatsu was lagging. Onoda could hear the man's ragged breathing, a desperate wheeze that sounded like a broken bellows. The private was stumbling over roots that he should have seen, his boots dragging heavy in the undergrowth. When Onoda glanced back, he saw Akatsu's eyes were wide, white discs of pure terror, fixed on the muzzle flashes behind them rather than the path ahead. The unit was escaping with the meat, but they were leaving something else behind in the chaos, their cohesion. Onoda tasted bile and iron. They were soldiers of the Emperor, yet they were running like common thieves into the dark. The desertion. The silence that morning was heavier than the humid air. It wasn't the natural quiet of the jungle waiting for dawn. It was a void, a conspicuous absence that pressed against the eardrums. Onoda woke to the sound of dripping water, the condensation rolling off the broad leaves above, but he did not hear the familiar, ragged wheeze of Private Akatsu. For weeks, Akatsu's breathing had been a barometer of their collective decay, a constant rattle of phlegm and exhaustion that signaled his unraveling mind. Now there was only the rhythmic patter of moisture hitting the mud. Onoda sat up, his joints popping with the damp stiffness of early morning, and looked to his left. The impression in the dirt was still visible, a shallow grave where a man had slept, but the man was gone. Shimada and Kozuka stood over a pile of equipment near the base of a mahogany tree. It was a tableau of surrender. Akatsu had left his rifle, his ammunition pouch, and his knapsack. To a soldier, abandoning one's weapon was the ultimate heresy, a spiritual suicide more profound than death itself. Onoda approached the pile, the wet soil squelching beneath his rotting boots. He ran a hand over the rifle stock. The wood was slick with dew, cold and inanimate. It was not just gear left behind. It was a breadcrumb trail, a deliberate shedding of the warrior caste to slip back into the world of the defeated. The realization hit Onoda with the force of a physical blow to the gut. Akatsu had not been taken by a predator or a patrol. He had walked away. Fear, cold and sharp, replaced the dull ache of hunger. Akatsu knew their patrol routes. He knew the location of their caches, the timing of their movements, and the codes they used to signal one another. The man they had starved with was now the single greatest threat to their existence. The jungle, once a fortress of green concealment, instantly transformed into a cage of glass. Every rustle of a fern was no longer a boar or a civet. It was Akatsu leading the enemy to their throats. They struck the camp immediately. There was no discussion, only the frantic, silent efficiency of men dismantling their lives. The lean-to structures they had painstakingly woven to divert the monsoon rains were kicked apart, the evidence scattered. They could not afford the luxury of a base. They had to become fluid, drifting through the topography like smoke. The sky opened up as they marched, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the jungle floor into a slurry of clay and rotting leaves. This was not a cleansing rain, it was an assault. The water was frigid, soaking through their tattered uniforms and leaching the remaining heat from their emaciated frames. They walked until their legs trembled, navigating slippery ravines and climbing slick, moss-covered ridges to ensure no tracks could be followed. Nightfall brought no relief, only a suffocating darkness and the relentless hammering of the rain. They huddled together under the buttress roots of a massive fig tree, shivering violently as the water pooled around their ankles. Sleep was impossible. Every time Onoda closed his eyes, he saw Akatsu's face, not as it was, but as it would be, guiding American soldiers through the underbrush, whispering their coordinates. The trinity of survivors sat in the mud, weapons clutched to their chests, listening to the jungle breathe. It felt wider now, vast and indifferent, and for the first time in 5 years, Onoda felt truly exposed. The war had changed. They were no longer hunting the enemy. They were being hunted by their own secrets. Injury. The skirmish at Gontan Beach had been a chaotic blur of sand and muzzle flashes, a violent interruption to their scavenging that ended as abruptly as it began. They had retreated into the dense interior, lungs burning, believing they had escaped unscathed, until Shimada collapsed against a limestone outcrop. It wasn't the clean puncture of a rifle round through the shoulder or the leg. It was a jagged, ugly tear across the abdomen. In the sterile halls of a Tokyo hospital, it would have been a grave injury. Here, amidst the microbes and the relentless humidity of Lubang, it was a death sentence written in slow motion. They dragged him into a fissure in the rock face, a cramped cave that smelled of bat guano and ancient dust. For 3 days, the cave became an oven of suffering. The air grew heavy, not just with the oppressive tropical heat, but with the cloying, sweet stench of necrosis. The wound was weeping, the skin around the entry turning a bruised purple, then a terrifying black. There were no antibiotics, no morphine to dull the jagged edges of his agony. There was only the milky water of green coconuts, trickle-fed between his cracked lips in a futile attempt to replace the fluids leaking out of him. Delirium. Onoda sat by his head, wiping the sweat from Shimada's forehead with a rag that had once been a uniform. The heat radiating off the man was palpable, a furnace burning itself out from the inside. Shimada was no longer in the cave. His mind was drifting through the haze of a fever dream, back to a Japan that no longer existed. He muttered names of family members, of girls he had known a lifetime ago, his voice rising from a whisper to a delirious shout that echoed dangerously off the stone walls. Danger. Every outburst sent a spike of adrenaline through Onoda's chest. The enemy patrols were aggressive now, emboldened by the beach encounter. Sound was their primary enemy. Onoda found his hand hovering over his friend's mouth, trembling with the horrific calculation of survival logic. If Shimada screamed, they would all die. The tension was a physical weight, a tight wire pulling between the loyalty of brotherhood and the cold necessity of remaining hidden. He watched the rise and fall of Shimada's chest, the rhythm hitching and stumbling as the infection seized his vital organs. The end did not come with a dramatic final words or a moment of clarity. It came in the gray light of dawn, amidst the grime and the silence. Shimada's breathing simply stopped, the rattle in his throat silencing abruptly, leaving a void in the cave that felt louder than any scream. He was gone. They buried him shallow, the limestone soil resisting their makeshift tools, scraping their knuckles raw against the earth. There was no ceremony, only the grim efficiency of covering the evidence. They packed the dirt down hard, masking the scent from the boars, and stood over the mound for a fleeting moment. The trinity was broken. The triangle of support that had sustained them through the monsoon and the hunger had collapsed into a line. Now there were only two. The drought. Desiccation. The island, usually a breathing entity of rot and moisture, had calcified into a brittle skeleton. The monsoon rains had failed, and for months the sun hammered the canopy with a malice that felt personal. The dense foliage that once offered silent concealment had withered into a carpet of brown, desiccated betrayal. Every step Onoda took was a gamble against the silence. The jungle floor, once a sponge of damp moss, was now a minefield of dried teak leaves and snapped twigs. To move was to announce one's presence to the world. Thirst had replaced the enemy soldiers as the primary architect of their terror. It was not merely the desire for a drink, it was a biological dismantling of the self. Onoda's tongue felt too large for his mouth, a swollen, sandpaper weight that made swallowing a jagged agony. His blood felt thick, sluggish in his veins, struggling to pump through a heart that fluttered like a dying bird. Beside him, Kozuka was a specter wrapped in tatters. His eyes were sunken so deep into his skull they looked like bruises, darting frantically at the shimmering heat haze that danced between the trees, promising phantom streams that evaporated upon approach. Risk. They had drained the stagnant, mosquito-choked puddles in the higher elevations weeks ago. Now, survival dictated a violation of their most sacred rule. They had to descend. The village perimeter lay ahead, bathed in the unforgiving amber light of the late afternoon. The descent had been a torture of slow motion, each foot placement taking nearly a minute to ensure the brittle vegetation didn't crack like a rifle shot under their weight. They watched the villagers from the tree line, their bodies pressed flat against the hot earth, smelling the smoke of cooking fires that twisted their empty stomachs into knots. But it was the stone well in the center of the clearing that held their gaze with magnetic, desperate intensity. The raid. Waiting for darkness was the tactical choice, but the dehydration was driving them toward madness. They moved when the fields emptied for the midday rest. Crouching low, moving with the predatory gait of starving wolves, they crossed the open ground. The heat radiating off the soil burned through the soles of their decaying boots. Upon reaching the well, the smell of damp stone hit Onoda with the force of a physical blow, dizzying and sweet. He gripped the rope. It was rough hemp, frayed and old. He looked at Kozuka, who stood watch with a rifle that shook in his weakened grip. Onoda began to lower the bucket. The rusted pulley screamed. To their heightened senses, the screech of metal on metal sounded like a siren wailing across the valley. Onoda froze, the vibration traveling up his arms, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he feared it would be audible from the huts 50 meters away. He waited, sweat stinging his eyes, blending with the grime on his face. Nothing moved in the village. The heat had driven everyone indoors. He continued, millimeter by millimeter, fighting the friction of the wheel. When the bucket finally slapped the water below, the sound was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. He hauled it up, the weight straining his atrophied muscles, the rope biting into his calloused palms. They did not drink with dignity. They buried their faces in the bucket, slurping and choking, the water spilling over their chins and washing away the dust of 1,000 days. It was cool, metallic, and tasted of life. For 10 seconds, the war did not exist. There was only the water and the terrified ecstasy of stealing it from the jaws of the enemy. Then, a dog barked in the distance. The spell broke. They turned and vanished back into the scorched tree line, leaving only wet footprints that evaporated seconds later in the relentless heat. The monsoon had returned, transforming the island from a calcified skeleton back into a weeping, suffocating sponge. Under the heavy, mildewed canvas of their stolen tarp, the air was thick enough to choke on, smelling of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, chemical tang of ozone. Between them sat the prize, not food or ammunition, but a small, rectangular box of black plastic and chrome. It was a transistor radio, snatched from a farmer's windowsill during a lightning raid 2 nights prior. To Onoda, it looked like a piece of alien technology, too sleek and fragile for the mud-caked reality of the jungle. The broadcast. Kozuka watched with feverish intensity as Onoda's filth-encrusted fingers manipulated the delicate dial. The speaker hissed, a sound like falling sand that grated against the silence of the forest. Onoda turned the wheel millimeters at a time, navigating the static ocean of the airwaves, searching for the lifeline of the motherland. The static cleared, replaced by the clear, polished baritone of a Japanese announcer. The voice did not speak of trench warfare or rationing. It spoke of the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Onoda sat frozen, the blood draining from his face, as the announcer described a city of neon lights and paved highways. The voice spoke of the Shinkansen, a bullet train tearing across the countryside at speeds that defied physics, a silver arrow piercing the heart of a revitalized nation. It described an economic miracle, a Japan rising not from ashes, but soaring into a stratosphere of wealth and luxury. It was a beautiful, seductive, and terrifying lie. Kozuka looked at Onoda, his eyes wide and glistening in the gloom. He wanted to believe. The hunger for comfort was naked on his face, a dangerous weakness that the enemy was exploiting with surgical precision. Onoda slammed his hand down, silencing the box. The silence that followed was heavier than the humidity. Inside Onoda's mind, the gears of denial ground against each other, sparking and smoking as he constructed a fortress of logic to repel the assault. Japan had not surrendered. The emperor was a god, and gods do not bow. Therefore, the Japan described in the box was a fabrication, a phantom state erected by American puppet masters. The real government must be in exile, perhaps in the frozen plains of Manchuria, regrouping, waiting for soldiers like him to hold the line. He looked at the radio with hatred. It was not a window to the world. It was a torture device designed to erode their resolve through envy. The enemy was no longer just hunting them with rifles. They were hunting them with prosperity. They were weaponizing the passage of time, broadcasting a fantasy of peace to make the mud and the rot feel unbearable. Onoda gripped the plastic casing until the plastic creaked under the pressure of his denial. He turned the dial again, forcing himself to listen to the lies, searching for the codes that weren't there. The monsoon rains had long since evaporated, leaving the island brittle, parched, and waiting for a spark. The jungle, usually a suffocating embrace of green wetness, had transformed into a tinderbox of brown kogan grass and dried husks. Onoda lay flat against the earth, the soil radiating a heat that baked his stomach through his tattered uniform. Below him, the valley floor was no longer a peaceful grid of agriculture. It was a furnace. The villagers, pushed to the brink by years of theft and fear, had adopted a scorched earth policy against their own livelihood. They were torching the harvest. Thick, oily plumes of smoke rolled up the hillside, carrying the distinct, sweet, acrid scent of burning carbohydrates. It was a smell that triggered a violent hunger in Onoda's gut, even as the smoke stung his eyes and coated his throat with ash. He watched through the shimmering heat haze as the farmers moved like silhouettes against the orange walls of flame, tossing torches into the mounds of gathered rice. To a civilian, this was madness. To Onoda, it was a tactical escalation. These were not farmers protecting their crops. They were enemy combatants executing a resource denial strategy designed to starve the Imperial Army into submission. Kazuka nudged him, his face wrapped in a rag that was already turning black with soot. His eyes were wide, reflecting the inferno below, communicating a panic that Onoda refused to acknowledge. Onoda signaled the advance. They would not retreat into the safety of the deep canopy. They would counterattack using the enemy's weapon against them. They sprinted down the slope, their boots slamming against the hard-packed dirt, rushing headlong into the periphery of the fire. The temperature spiked drastically, the air becoming a physical weight that pressed against their chests. Onoda targeted the massive piles of discarded rice husks on the windward side of the village. With a flick of his lighter, he introduced a new variable to the chaos. The dry chaff caught instantly, not with a roar, but with a terrifying, sucking gasp as the oxygen was consumed. The raid. A wall of dense, blinding white smoke erupted, mixing with the black soot of the burning fields. Onoda plunged into the opacity. Vision was reduced to zero. The world was nothing but gray, swirling heat and the sound of dry matter disintegrating. He moved by memory and instinct, the smoke searing his lungs like inhaled broken glass. He could hear the confused shouting of the villagers, their voices distorted and panicked as the wind drove the suffocating cloud directly into their settlement. They were choking on the war he had brought to their doorstep. He stumbled over a root, his hand landing on a dropped sack of unburnt grain. The burlap was hot to the touch, almost blistering his calloused palms. He hoisted the prize onto his shoulder, the weight crushing, and pivoted back toward the tree line. Emerging from the smoke was like breaking the surface of a deep, dark ocean. Onoda gasped, sucking in the relatively cooler air of the forest edge, his saliva thick and black with particulate matter. He looked back only once. The valley was gone, erased by a man-made storm of ash and fire. A hellscape where two soldiers fought a phantom war against people who simply wanted to eat. The harvest was gone, but the war remained. October 1972. October 1972 brought a different kind of suffocation. The frantic heat of the burning valley had been replaced by the damp, chilling stillness of twilight near the village of Talik. The air here was heavy with moisture and the metallic tang of impending rain, causing the tall kogon grass to cling to their uniforms like wet fingers. Onoda and Kozuka moved not as men, but as hungry ghosts, haunting the periphery of the harvest. They were not setting a wildfire this time. This was a precision strike intended to demoralize the farmers who dared to harvest under the nose of the emperor. Kozuka moved forward to the nearest shock of dried rice, his silhouette jagged and skeletal against the fading purple sky. He looked less like a soldier and more like a collection of wires and tension held together by sheer will. Onoda hung back, his eyes scanning the tree line, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard of his Type 99 rifle. The instinct that had kept them alive for 27 years began to itch at the base of his skull, a primal warning that the silence of the paddy was artificial. A singular, deafening crack tore through the humid air, shattering the evening calm. It was not the chaotic roar of a fire, but the precise, lethal snap of a high-velocity round breaking the sound barrier. Onoda watched, time dilating into a slow-motion horror as the impact lifted Kozuka off his feet. There was no cry, no dramatic flailing. The bullet struck with the force of a sledgehammer, punching through the fragile cage of ribs and obliterating the heart instantly. Kozuka's body went limp before gravity reclaimed it, crumpling into the mud with a wet, heavy thud that sounded sickeningly final. Onoda lunged forward, ignoring the tactical suicide of breaking cover, his hands grasping for the strap of Kozuka's rifle. He grabbed his comrade's shoulder, intending to drag him to the defilade of the brush, but the dead weight was absolute. He looked down. Kozuka's eyes were open, staring fixedly at the darkening clouds, the pupils already dilating into nothingness. The chest wound did not bleed, it poured, a dark, arterial flood that soaked Onoda's hands and turned the paddy water black. Another shot whizzed past Onoda's ear, the displacement of air stinging his cheek like a whip. He released the uniform. The logic of survival, cold and mathematical, overrode the screaming grief in his chest. To stay was to die. To carry the body was to die. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the slick mud, forcing his body into the dense undergrowth as more shots chewed up the vegetation where he had stood seconds prior. He did not fire back. There was no target, only the inevitability of the enemy's numbers. He ran until his lungs burned with a fire hotter than the rice fields, collapsing only when the jungle became impassable to anyone but him. Absolute solitude. The silence that descended upon the jungle was heavier than the entire 27 years of warfare combined. It was a physical pressure, pressing against his eardrums, vast and terrifying. For decades, the entity known as the Imperial Army on Lubang had been a multi-celled organism. First a platoon, then a squad, then a pair. They had shared warmth, fear, strategy, and memory. Now the organism was dead. Onoda sat in the mud, the darkness absolute. He looked at his hands, invisible in the gloom, but feeling sticky and cooling rapidly. He was no longer a commander. He was no longer a squad leader. He was a singular biological anomaly, a relic of a dead empire, drifting alone in a void. The war had not ended, but the world he lived in had just shrunk to the size of his own skin. The one-man war. Dehumanization. The year 1973 dissolved the man named Hiroo Onoda and left only a biological mechanism in his place. The jungle was no longer terrain to be traversed. It was a second skin, a chaotic tapestry of vines and rot that he had stitched himself into. He had ceased speaking entirely. The vocal cords, unused for months since the last exchange of tactical whispers with a dead man, felt calcified in his throat. When he swallowed, it was a dry, scraping sensation, as if his body was forgetting how to be human. There was no one to command, no one to warn, and the silence of the Lubang interior was not empty. It was a roaring, crowded void that pressed against his temples with the weight of deep water. The ghost. He had become an architect of his own invisibility. He coated his skin in layers of river clay and crushed charcoal, masking the pale geometry of a human face that evolution had designed to be recognized. Over his tattered uniform, he wove a ghillie suit of living misery. Dried ferns, decaying leaves, and strips of bark that smelled of wet earth and fungus. The insects no longer bit him. They simply marched across his hands as if he were dead wood. The heat was a constant, suffocating blanket that trapped the stench of his own unwashed body inside the mud casing. But he did not sweat. To sweat was to lose water, and his metabolism had slowed to the glacial pace of a reptilian predator waiting for the sun. Discipline. He stood motionless near a game trail for 14 hours. The discipline required was agonizing, a screaming tension in the muscles that had to be suppressed by a mind fractured into pure will. A small, emerald dove fluttered down from the canopy, its wings beating the humid air. It did not see a soldier. It saw a stump. The bird landed on his shoulder, its talons digging faintly into the hardened clay of his epaulets. Onoda did not blink. He did not breathe. He existed in the space between heartbeats, a statue of war carved from the jungle itself. His mind, however, was a relentless, churning engine of tactical calculus. The memories of Wakayama, of his mother's face, of the taste of red bean paste, they were bleaching out, like photographs left too long in the sun. What remained was the mission. The mission was the spine that held him upright when the loneliness threatened to buckle his knees. He looked down at the Arisaka Type 99 rifle resting in his grip. The wood stock was polished smooth by the oils of his palm, and the steel receiver gleamed with a dark, lethal luster. It was the only object in this green hell that possessed moral clarity. People died, flesh rotted, and empires fell silent. But the bolt-action mechanism remained true. To the villagers below, he was no longer a straggler from a defeated army. He was the mountain demon, a phantom that stole cattle and vanished into the rain. They feared the shadows of the trees because they knew the shadows had eyes. Onoda watched them from the ridge, his finger hovering over the trigger guard, not out of malice, but out of habit. He was the apex predator of this island, the last living cell of the Imperial Japanese Army, waiting for an order that would never come. The encounter. The scent of the intruder arrived before the sound. It was a sharp, chemical odor that violated the organic rot of the jungle floor, the smell of processed nylon, sweet tobacco, and soap. To Hiroo Onoda, whose olfactory senses had been tuned to the frequency of decay and rain for 3 decades, it was as distinct as a flare fired in a pitch-black room. He did not freeze this time. He moved. He slid through the wet undergrowth with the fluid, predatory gait of a wolf closing the gap on a wounded deer. His body low to the ground, knees bent to absorb the snap of twigs. He crested the small rise and looked down into the clearing. The sight was an affront to his tactical reality. A tent, garishly bright and aggressively artificial, sat in the center of the mud like a tumor. Sitting before it was a man who looked nothing like the Filipino police or the American GIs of his nightmares. The stranger was young, wearing loose, impractical clothing, his hair long and unkempt. He was boiling water over a small fire, completely exposed. radiating a lethal carelessness that made Onoda's teeth grind together. This was not a soldier. This was a mockery. Confrontation. Onoda burst from the foliage. He did not emerge tentatively. He exploded into the clearing with the accumulated violence of 29 years. He leveled the Arasaka rifle, the stock slamming into the familiar hollow of his shoulder, the muzzle unwavering as it sought the center of the stranger's chest. His finger took up the slack on the trigger, the metal warm and greasy against his skin. He screamed a command, his voice ragged and feral, demanding identification, expecting the man to scramble for a weapon or flee into the trees to be cut down. The salute. The young man did not run. He did not reach for a gun. Norio Suzuki stood up slowly, dusting the dirt from his knees with a terrifying calmness. He looked down the barrel of the rifle, past the iron sights, and locked eyes with the wild, mud-caked specter trembling with adrenaline. Then, with a stiff, practiced motion, the hippie brought his hand to his forehead. He saluted. Shock. The silence that followed was heavier than the human air. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, the cicadas pausing their screeching chorus. Onoda felt the world tilt on its axis. The enemy was supposed to fire back. The enemy was supposed to die. The enemy was not supposed to show respect. They sat by the fire as the sun collapsed below the tree line, plunging the island into a suffocating darkness. The firelight danced on the steel of the rifle, which Onoda never let go of. Suzuki spoke of a Japan that sounded like a hallucination. Skyscrapers, bullet trains, peace treaties signed decades ago. He offered food, but Onoda chewed slowly, his stomach twisting in knots. The words, "the war is over," hung between them, alien and poisonous. Onoda stared into the flames, his mind a fortress of denial. If the war was over, then his 30 years of starvation, the death of his comrades, the killing of villagers, it all meant nothing. That was a psychological precipice he could not step off of.
He looked at the young adventurer, his eyes hard and glassy. He would not leave. He would not surrender. Not without the direct, written command of Major Taniguchi. Until that piece of paper existed, the war continued, and the jungle remained his only commanding officer. The rendezvous point was a blister of open earth, baked hard by the relentless Philippine sun. Hiroo Onoda waited in the shadow of a sprawling banyan tree, his breathing shallow and controlled, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had spent the previous night preparing his uniform, patching the rotting fabric with surgical precision, polishing the brass buttons until his thumbs were raw and blistered. He needed to look like a soldier of the Imperial Army, not the feral ghost the jungle had tried to turn him into. The air was thick and still, heavy with the metallic taste of ozone and the sour stench of decomposing vegetation, a suffocating blanket that pressed against his skin. Then the sky tore open. It began as a vibration in the soles of his boots, a tremor that escalated into a rhythmic concussion battering the air. A helicopter crested the tree line, a mechanical dragonfly of olive drab and steel, its rotors churning up a blinding storm of dust and dried leaves. Onoda shielded his eyes, squinting against the stinging grit. This was modern machinery, loud and arrogant, descending with a violence that made the jungle cower. As the skids touched the earth, the engine whined down to a high-pitched scream, and the wind died, leaving a ringing silence in his ears that felt louder than the noise. Norio Suzuki stepped out first, waving enthusiastically, but Onoda's predator gaze swept past the hippie instantly. A second figure emerged, moving with the stiff, careful gait of the elderly. The man wore a short-sleeved shirt and trousers that looked painfully civilian, draped over shoulders that had slumped under the weight of time. Onoda felt a spike of icy nausea in his gut. This was not the warrior of his memories. This was a grandfather, a shopkeeper, a shadow. His finger twitched near the trigger guard of his Arasaka. Was this a trick? An American psychological operation designed to break his resolve with a grotesque pantomime? The old man straightened his back, spotting Onoda in the shadows.
He adjusted his glasses, and for a fleeting second, the sun caught the angle of his jaw. The recognition hit Onoda with the force of a physical blow. The flesh was withered, the hair was gray, but the eyes were the same, cold, assessing, and commanding. It was Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Onoda stepped forward, his legs moving like rusted pistons. He halted 10 paces away, snapping his heels together with a sharp crack that echoed across the clearing. His salute was rigid, a desperate attempt to hold his crumbling reality together with military discipline. Taniguchi did not smile. He did not embrace his lost subordinate. He simply opened a folder, his hands trembling slightly, and began to read. The voice was raspy, worn down by age, but the cadence was unmistakable. The words were dry, bureaucratic, and devoid of glory. He read the imperial rescript surrendering all troops. He read the order relieving Lieutenant Onoda of all duties. He read the command to cease all hostile action immediately. The jungle did not explode. The sky did not fall. There was only the dry rustle of paper and the distant call of a bird. Onoda stood paralyzed, the rifle in his hand suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds. The structure of his universe, built on the bedrock of duty and the promise of victory, evaporated into the humid air. 29 years. The rainy seasons that had rotted his skin, the gnawing hunger that had eaten his muscle, the friends he had buried in the mud. It was all for a war that had ended while he was still a young man. The cognitive dissonance shattered him. He wasn't a hero holding the line. He was a relic guarding a graveyard. His knees buckled. The rifle slipped from his grasp, the wooden stock thudding dully against the dirt. A sound ripped from his throat, a guttural, jagged noise that was neither a sob nor a scream. It was the sound of a soul being hollowed out. He wept openly, his body shaking with the violence of his grief, the tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. He did not cry for joy. He cried because the jungle was no longer his enemy, and without the war, Hiroo Onoda was nothing. The sword. The sword was the last thing that made sense. In the humid air of the surrender ceremony, the blade felt heavy in Hiroo Onoda's grip, a familiar extension of his own arm that he was now forcing himself to amputate.
He had spent the morning shaving the beard that had been his camouflage, the razor scraping away layers of grit and time until a stranger's face stared back from the mirror. His uniform, patched and repatched until it was more thread than fabric, was pressed clean, but it sat stiffly against skin that was accustomed to the rot and damp of the undergrowth. He marched toward President Marcos not as a man, but as a mechanical construct of duty, each step on the pavement sending a jarring shock through his spine that the soft jungle floor had never inflicted. The ambush began not with gunfire, but with light. Hundreds of cameras erupted simultaneously, a blinding barrage of magnesium and electronic flashes that seared his retinas. It was a new kind of artillery, a bombardment of attention that felt more exposing than any searchlight. Onoda did not flinch, though his instinct screamed at him to dive for cover. He stopped before the president, bowed with the rigid geometry of the Imperial Army, and extended his hands. The scabbard was scarred and scratched, a map of 29 years of survival. But when he drew the blade slightly, the steel gleamed with a predatory perfection. He had oiled it with stolen fat and polished it with his own resolve. He surrendered the weapon. The moment the weight left his hands, a terrifying lightness took hold, as if gravity itself had released him. He was no longer a soldier. He was just an aging man standing in the Philippines. Civilization assaulted him immediately. The air at the airbase did not smell of wet earth or decaying leaves. It reeked of unburnt kerosene and exhaust fumes, a chemical stench that coated the back of his throat like oil.
Someone handed him a bottle of soda, the glass sweating with condensation. He took a sip, and the liquid was a shock of violence. Impossibly cold, aggressively sweet, and sharp with carbonation that burned his gums. It tasted like luxury, and it made him want to vomit. Later, in the hotel, the bed was a trap. The mattress was too soft, a suffocating embrace that offered no resistance to his body. He lay awake in the unnatural, air-conditioned chill, listening to the hum of electricity rather than the breathing of the jungle. He looked at his hands in the darkness. They were clean, scrubbing away the blood and the dirt, but the calluses remained. These were hands designed to strangle, to dig, to kill. Civilization assaulted him immediately. The air at the airbase did not smell of wet earth or decaying leaves. It reeked of unburnt kerosene and exhaust fumes, a chemical stench that coated the back of his throat like oil. Someone handed him a bottle of soda, the glass sweating with condensation. He took a sip, and the liquid was a shock of violence. Impossibly cold, aggressively sweet, and sharp with carbonation that burned his gums. It tasted like luxury, and it made him want to vomit. Later, in the hotel, the bed was a trap. The mattress was too soft, a suffocating embrace that offered no resistance to his body. He lay awake in the unnatural, air-conditioned chill, listening to the hum of electricity rather than the breathing of the jungle. He looked at his hands in the darkness. They were clean, scrubbing away the blood and the dirt, but the calluses remained. These were hands designed to strangle, to dig, to kill.
In this world of soft sheets and cold drinks, they were obsolete tools. The flight home was the final severance. Onoda pressed his forehead against the thick plexiglass of the porthole as the plane banked sharply, the engines roaring with a power that mocked the silence of the mountains. Below him, the island of Lubang was a sprawling mass of emerald green, a dense, impenetrable fortress of vines and shadows. Somewhere down there, in the rotting dark, the ghost of Lieutenant Onoda was still crouching in the mud, rifle raised, waiting for an enemy that would never come. The man in the seat sat back and closed his eyes. The survivor had left the jungle, but his soul remained down there, tangled in the roots, forever fighting the war that never ended.